The scent of damp earth and beeswax candles filled the small, stone chapel, a fragrance that would forever be seared into Anya's memory as the smell of her own surrender. At 13, she was a sapling bent by a storm, her slight frame swallowed by the heavy, traditional wedding gown, its intricate embroidery feeling less like decoration and more like chains. The fabric scratched against her skin, a constant, irritating reminder of the ritual being imposed upon her. Standing at the altar, she could feel the weight of the entire village's gaze, a silent, collective pressure that pushed the air from her lungs. Her eyes, wide with a fear too profound for tears, sought refuge in the faces of her parents, who stood just feet away. But their gazes were carefully averted, her mother's fixed on the rough-hewn floorboards, her father's on the stoic priest. Their avoidance was a deeper, more personal betrayal than the ceremony itself, a confirmation that she was utterly alone. Beside her, Boris was a monolith of expectation. He was not a man but an institution, his presence a solid, unyielding force that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. His large, work-roughened hand enveloped hers, his grip firm and possessive, a promise of the control that was to come. The priest's voice droned on, the ancient words of union and blessing sounding like a sentence. Each phrase was a nail in the coffin of her childhood, a ritualized extinguishing of the small, bright dreams she had once harbored. The villagers, rows of somber faces in worn wool, watched the transaction with a passive acceptance that spoke of generations of similar silences. This was the way of their world, a tradition built not on joy, but on the quiet consolidation of power and the unspoken enforcement of roles. As the final prayer was murmured and the cold, metal band of a wedding ring was slipped onto her finger, a final, chilling certainty settled over Anya. The ring was too large, a symbol of a life that did not fit. It was in that moment, surrounded by the hollow ritual and the averted eyes of those who had birthed her, that a new, fierce emotion ignited within her chest, a small, stubborn flame in the overwhelming darkness. It was not hope, for hope felt too fragile, too easily extinguished. It was resolve. A silent, searing vow etched itself onto her soul, a promise whispered only to herself beneath the weight of the forced vows she had just spoken aloud. She would endure. She would observe. She would survive this. The ceremony ended, and as Boris led his new wife from the chapel, Anya kept her head bowed, but behind her lowered lids, her eyes burned with the first fire of a future rebellion. The farmhouse stood at the end of a long, muddy track, a hulking silhouette of weathered wood and neglect against a bruised twilight sky. It was a place that did not invite, but commanded, its windows like sightless eyes watching the empty fields that stretched for miles in every direction. As the cart creaked to a halt, Boris's grip on Anya's arm was the only thing that pulled her from the bench, his touch a brand of ownership. He did not speak, merely pointed a thick finger toward the heavy oak door before turning to unharness the horse, leaving her to step across the threshold into her new life alone. Inside, the air was thick and still, heavy with the ghosts of old meals and the pervasive scent of damp timber and dust. The main room was a cavern of shadows, sparsely furnished with pieces that were functional and severe. There was no warmth here, no hint of a woman's touch or a child's laughter. It was a space built for utility, for endurance, not for living. Boris's instructions began almost immediately, a low, monotonous list of duties delivered without looking at her. The hearth must be swept, the pots scrubbed until they shone, the floors mopped, the linens beaten free of dust. His words were not requests but decrees, outlining the borders of her world, which had shrunk to the dimensions of this lonely house and the relentless cycle of chores that filled it. Her movements were to be confined to the yard and the kitchen garden. The woods that bordered the property were strictly forbidden, the village a distant memory. Days bled into one another, a gray tapestry woven with the threads of endless labor. Anya's hands, once soft and small, grew raw and chapped from lye soap and cold water. Her back ached from scrubbing and hauling, her spirit worn thin by the isolation and the silent, looming presence of her husband. It was during these tasks, in the quiet moments of polishing a dusty side table or sweeping a forgotten corner, that her eyes began to wander, to truly see the house that was now her prison. Her attention was caught by the portraits. They hung in a grim procession along the steep staircase, generations of stern-faced men and pale, joyless women, their features rendered in dark, oily strokes. They were the Petrovs, Boris's lineage. Anya had heard the village stories, the tales of a proud and prosperous family, of merchants and landowners who had shaped the local history. But the faces in the frames told a different, quieter story. There was no pride in their painted eyes, only a hollow severity, a kind of weary bitterness that seemed to seep from the canvas. The prosperous merchant grandfather, according to lore, had eyes that were supposed to twinkle with cunning and charm. The portrait showed a man with a pinched mouth and a gaze full of cold calculation. The family narratives, repeated at festivals and gatherings, spoke of unity and strength. These faces spoke of secrets and silences, of things best left unexamined. A small, cold knot of doubt tightened in Anya's stomach, the first crack in the wall of accepted truth she had been born into. The stories she had been told and the evidence before her eyes did not align, and in that dissonance, the first seed of suspicion took root, growing in the dark, fertile soil of her confinement. The dust in the attic was a century thick, a soft, gray shroud that settled over forgotten furniture and shrouded shapes of memory. Each footstep on the bare floorboards sent up plumes of it, motes dancing in the single, slanting bar of sunlight that cut through the grime-caked circular window. This was Boris's domain, a place he had explicitly forbidden her from entering, which made the act of pushing open the creaking door and stepping inside feel like her first true act of defiance. The air was stale and cold, smelling of decayed paper, old wool, and the profound silence of things long abandoned. Anya had been tasked with cleaning the upper landing, but the pull of the forbidden space had been irresistible, a siren call from the secrets she now suspected the house held. She moved slowly, her rag clutched tightly in one hand, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. In the farthest, darkest corner, tucked beneath the steep pitch of the roof, something caught the weak light. It was a chest, not large, but solidly built from a dark, aged wood, its surface carved with intricate, swirling patterns that were now clogged with grime. A heavy iron lock, rusted with age, secured its lid. Unlike the other discarded items around it, this chest had not been carelessly stored. It had been deliberately placed, hidden away from casual sight. Anya knelt before it, her breath catching. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal of the lock and traced the patterns in the wood. A strange sensation prickled up her spine, a cold certainty that this box was not merely forgotten, but intentionally concealed. It seemed to hum with a silent, potent energy, as if the very secrets it contained were straining against the wood. The sudden, heavy footfall on the attic stairs was like a thunderclap in the silence. Anya scrambled back from the chest, her pulse roaring in her ears, just as Boris's large frame filled the doorway. His eyes, dark and sharp, scanned the room and immediately fixed on her, kneeling in the dust before the chest. His expression did not change, but a new, dangerous stillness came over him. He did not shout. He did not need to. The quiet menace in his voice was far more terrifying. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his shadow falling over her like a physical weight. He did not look at the chest, his gaze pinned solely on her. His hand shot out, not to strike her, but to grip her upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with bruising force as he pulled her to her feet and away from the corner. He steered her roughly toward the door, his silence more threatening than any curse. At the top of the stairs, he finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly warning that left no room for question. She was never to come up here again. The attic was not her concern. The things in this house that did not belong to her were to remain untouched. Then he released her with a slight shove, his eyes promising consequences she did not want to imagine. Back in the dim light of the landing, her arm throbbing, Anya's fear began to curdle into a sharper, more potent emotion. His reaction had not been one of simple anger over a disobeyed order. It had been a reflex of protection, a violent guarding of that specific object. The locked chest was no longer just a piece of old furniture. It was a testament. Boris's fierce warning was the key that turned the lock in her mind, confirming everything her doubts had whispered. The chest held something he feared her finding. And as she stood there, the dust of the past still clinging to her skirts, Anya knew with a chilling clarity that her survival now depended on uncovering the dark history sealed within that dark, wooden heart. The memory of the locked chest burned in Anya's mind, a constant, smoldering ember beneath the drudgery of her daily tasks. Boris's warning echoed in the silence of the house, but it was no longer a deterrent. It was a catalyst. Every time his heavy boots trod across the floorboards, every time his shadow fell across her path, her resolve hardened. The chest was the answer, she was certain of it. It held the truth behind the dissonance between the village lore and the grim faces in the portraits, the reason for her parents' averted eyes, the secret to the cold dread that had taken root in her own life. She began to watch Boris with the intense, silent focus of a hunter, noting his routines, the pockets of time when he was occupied in the fields or the barn, his predictable journeys to the village for supplies. Her survival, she now understood, was no longer just about enduring his rules, but about breaking them. His study was the heart of his dominion, a small, cluttered room off the main living area where he kept his ledgers and accounts. He always closed the door behind him, a silent assertion of a boundary she was not to cross. One afternoon, under the pretense of bringing in laundry, she saw him stride toward the distant tree line, his axe slung over his shoulder, a task that would occupy him for hours. The house fell into a profound, waiting silence. This was her moment. Slipping into the study felt like stepping into the lair of a predator. The air was thick with the smell of old leather, tobacco, and male solitude. Her eyes scanned the room, darting over the heavy desk, the crammed bookshelves, the single, stiff-backed chair. Where would a man like Boris hide something he never wanted found? Her search was frantic, her fingers trembling as they skimmed along the backs of books, felt along the underside of the desk, and probed the dusty recesses of drawers filled with mundane tools and papers. Just as a flicker of despair began to rise, her gaze fell upon the mantelpiece above the small, cold fireplace. There, nestled between a tarnished brass candlestick and a dead potted plant, was a small, carved wooden box she had always assumed held tobacco. It was the one decorative object in the room, out of place in its utilitarian starkness. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay no tobacco. Instead, a single tarnished silver key gleamed dully in the weak light. It was heavy, cold, and intricately wrought, its teeth worn with age. It was a perfect, terrible match for the lock she had seen in the attic. Clutching the key, its metal seeming to burn her palm, Anya moved like a ghost through the silent house and up the steep stairs to the attic door. Pushing it open, the familiar scent of dust and decay greeted her like an old accomplice. She went straight to the chest in the dark corner, her breath held tight in her chest. Kneeling, she fitted the key into the rusted lock. For a terrifying second, it resisted, and she feared it was the wrong key, or that the mechanism had frozen shut for good. Then, with a gritty, reluctant groan that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, the lock turned. The lid was heavy, but she pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a long, mournful creak. The interior exhaled a breath of camphor and aged paper. The contents were not gold or jewels, but something far more valuable. A history. Neatly stacked inside were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, a few leather-bound journals, and a collection of old photographs. Her hands, now shaking uncontrollably, reached in and lifted the topmost photograph. It showed a younger, less severe Boris standing beside a woman whose face was achingly familiar, a face from her own earliest memories, softened by youth and a smile that had long since vanished from her mother's eyes. Beneath the photos was a document, a family tree drawn in elegant, faded ink. Her eyes, blurred with unshed tears and a dawning horror, scanned the names, the connecting lines a web of deceit. There was her mother's name, linked not just to her father, but by another, fainter line to Boris's. And there, at the convergence of these lines, was her own name, Anya. The connection was not explicit, not yet fully formed in her reeling mind, but the proximity of the names, the architecture of the chart, hinted at a hidden, terrible bond that explained everything and nothing all at once. She stared at the evidence in her hands, the cold weight of the key forgotten on the floor beside her, the dust of the past now settling on the truth she had so desperately sought. The faded ink on the parchment seemed to writhe and twist before Anya's eyes, the elegant, looping script a malevolent spell unraveling her entire world. The single, slanting beam of light from the attic window illuminated the family tree she had spread across her knees, turning the paper a sickly yellow and making the names stand out like accusations. Her gaze, frantic and disbelieving, traced the lines again and again, a desperate attempt to find an error, a different interpretation, anything but the horrifying truth laid bare in iron gall and history. There was her mother's name, Alara, connected by the solid, accepted line to her father, Pyotr. But from Alara, another line branched off, not a line of marriage, but of blood. It led directly to Boris Petrov. The chart labeled him clearly, unequivocally, Boris, son of Gregor, brother of Alara. The air fled her lungs in a silent, agonized rush. Brother. The word echoed in the hollow of her skull, a tolling bell of damnation. Boris was not just her husband, her jailer. He was her mother's brother, her uncle. The knowledge struck her with the force of a physical blow, a nausea so profound it made the dusty attic spin. The forced marriage, her parents' shamed silence, the grim severity in the Petrov portraits. It all crystallized into a single, monstrous understanding. This was not merely a transaction of power or property. It was a gnarled, rotten branch of the same poison tree, a perversion woven into the very fabric of her being. The vows she had spoken in the chapel were not just a prison sentence. They were a sacrilege. A cold, clammy horror seeped from her core, icing her veins and tightening her skin. Her hands began to shake so violently the parchment rattled. The photographs scattered around her, the young Boris, the smiling Alara, were no longer charming relics. They were evidence of a shared childhood, a shared bloodline that had been twisted into something unspeakable. The face she saw every day across the dinner table, the face of the man who owned her, was a distorted mirror of her mother's, a reflection of her own. A silent scream built in her throat, so immense it threatened to shatter her from the inside. She clamped a hand over her mouth, her body trembling with the effort of containing the primal revulsion and terror. This knowledge was a death sentence. If Boris knew she had discovered this, the isolation of the farmhouse would become a true tomb. His warnings, his control took on a new, more sinister dimension. This secret was the foundation upon which his authority, and the silence of the entire village, was built. To possess it was to hold a lit match over a powder keg. With frantic, jerky movements, she gathered the damning documents. She shoved the family tree back into its leather portfolio, scooped up the photographs, and thrust everything back into the chest, her fingers fumbling and clumsy. The lid fell with a heavy, final thud that echoed in the silent attic. She turned the key, the metallic click sounding like the cocking of a gun. Hiding the key back in its wooden box in the study felt like disposing of a murder weapon. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from outside, sent fresh jolts of panic through her. She returned to her chores, her body moving on autopilot, scrubbing and sweeping while her mind reeled in a private hell. The implications unfolded like a poisonous flower. Her own existence was a product of this tangled, hidden history. Her mother's life had been a lie. Her marriage was an abomination. The weight of it pressed down on her, a suffocating blanket of deceit. She was no longer just a trapped girl. She was a living, breathing secret, a testament to a sin so profound it had to be buried, first in silence, and now in her. The evidence was hidden, locked away in the dark attic, but the truth was now locked within her, a terrifying, volatile truth that had forever altered the very ground beneath her feet. The truth was a poison, and Anya felt its slow, insidious spread through every part of her being. In the days that followed the discovery in the attic, the the farmhouse, once a prison of chores and silence, became a theater of the grotesque. Every sight of Boris was a fresh assault. The set of his shoulders, the shape of his hands, the line of his jaw, all were now terrible echoes of her mother's features, distorted through a lens of horror. She could no longer look at him without seeing the ghost of her own bloodline staring back, a monstrous reflection that turned her stomach. Denial became her first, flimsy shield. She told herself she had misread the chart, that the faded ink had tricked her eyes, that the word brother could mean something else in the old village dialect. But the cold, hard certainty in her gut mocked these fragile lies. The truth was a stain that would not wash out. She began to avoid him with a frantic, palpable terror. If his footsteps sounded in the hall, she would flee to the farthest room, pressing herself against the wall until he passed. Meals, once endured in heavy silence, became unbearable. She would claim a sudden illness, a lack of appetite, anything to escape the sight of him chewing his food, of his hands. Hands that were her uncle's hands, holding a knife and fork. She took her food to her small, barren room, eating alone in the dark, the silence now a sanctuary rather than a sentence. Her movements around the house became those of a ghost, silent and fleeting, her gaze perpetually downcast, her entire being curled inward as if to make herself smaller, less visible to the predator she now knew him to be. Her withdrawal did not go unnoticed. Boris's eyes, those dark, calculating eyes she now saw as a predator's, followed her with a new, speculative intensity. He said nothing, but his silence was more threatening than any interrogation. It was a waiting silence, the quiet of a cat watching a mouse, and it coiled around her throat like a noose. The fear was a physical presence, a cold stone in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She started at every sound, her sleep fractured by nightmares of locked chests and accusing faces, of a wedding ring that was also a shackle of blood. A rare trip to the village well for water offered no respite, only a new layer of dread. As she drew water, two older women from nearby farms fell silent as she approached, their conversation halting mid-sentence. They offered tight, pitying smiles that did not reach their eyes. As she turned to leave, the heavy bucket pulling at her thin arms, their hushed whispers drifted back to her on the still air. "The Petrov curse," one murmured. "Old sins have long shadows," replied the other, her voice laced with a grim satisfaction. "The girl pays the price." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Old sins, the phrase echoed the monstrous truth festering inside her. It was not just her secret. It was a village secret, a known, whispered thing. The averted eyes at her wedding, the passive acceptance of her fate. It all made a terrible, collusive sense. They knew, or they suspected enough to whisper, to pity, but not enough to act. The fear that had been a private, chilling companion now swelled into a tidal wave of existential terror. She was not just living a lie. She was living inside a web of communal deceit, a gilded cage whose bars were made of silence and complicity. The whispers did not shatter her resolve. They forged it in fire. The full truth was not just a personal need for clarity anymore. It was a weapon, the only one she might possess. She had to know everything, to arm herself with the complete, unvarnished history, no matter how ugly, no matter the risk. The fear was immense, a yawning chasm at her feet, but the need to step across it, to seek the full, terrible truth, had become an even greater, more desperate force. The whispers from the well, those two venomous words, old sins coiled in Anya's mind, transforming her private horror into a public specter. She was no longer just a girl trapped in a terrible secret. She was a character in a story the entire village seemed to know, a living, breathing monument to a transgression everyone acknowledged but no one named. This realization burned away the last vestiges of her paralyzing fear, replacing it with a cold, sharp-edged resolve. She had to know. She had to find someone, anyone, who would give shape to the ghost haunting her life. The risk of asking, of drawing attention to her suspicions, was terrifying, but the agony of not knowing had become unbearable. The annual harvest market, a bustling convergence of the village, presented her only opportunity. a fleeting chance to move among the crowd and seek a crack in the wall of silence. On market day, the village square was a riot of color and noise, a stark contrast to the grim silence of the farmhouse. The air was thick with the scent of roasting meats, sweet pastries, and the earthy smell of ripe produce. Laughter and bartering filled the space, a normalcy that felt alien and mocking. Anya moved through the throng like a wraith, her plain dress and downcast eyes making her invisible. Boris was nearby, haggling over the price of a new scythe blade, his attention momentarily captured. This was her moment. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a face that held neither the judgment of the younger women nor the blank indifference of the men. She found her target near a stall selling woven baskets. An elderly woman with a face like a weathered map, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor, her eyes holding a deep, weary knowledge. Anya approached, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She picked up a small basket, her fingers trembling as she pretended to examine the weave. The old woman watched her, her gaze steady and unervingly perceptive. Summoning every ounce of her courage, Anya kept her voice a low, casual murmur, barely audible above the market din. She spoke of her mother, Ilara, of how she missed her, of how little she knew of her family's past before her marriage. She asked if the woman had known her mother when she was young, if she remembered what she was like. The change in the woman's demeanor was instantaneous and chilling. The mild curiosity in her eyes vanished, replaced by a guarded, flinty sharpness. Her friendly posture stiffened, her shoulders drawing back as if from a physical threat. She took the basket from Anya's hands and placed it back on the stall with a definitive thud. Her answers were not lies, but they were masterpieces of evasion, crafted from a lifetime of practiced silence. She said she barely remembered Ilara as a girl, that the Petrovs and their kin had always kept to themselves, that some family histories were like old roots, best left undisturbed lest you disturb the whole tree. Her words were bland, non-committal, but her eyes, fixed on Anya, screamed a warning as clear as any shout. She looked at Anya not with pity, but with a kind of frantic urgency, a silent plea to stop, to turn back, to bury the questions that threatened to unearth things far more dangerous than mere memories. The woman then turned abruptly away, busying herself with rearranging her baskets, her back a firm, unyielding wall. The conversation was over. The dismissal was absolute. Anya stood frozen for a moment, the cheerful noise of the market suddenly sounding hollow and distant, a cruel parody of community. The woman's evasiveness, her palpable fear, had been more confirming than any direct answer could ever have been. It was a confession in reverse. It screamed that the truth was real, that it was terrible, and that it was protected by a conspiracy of silence that stretched across generations. The cold resolve that had brought her to the market solidified into something harder, more durable, like iron cooling in a forge. They could refuse to speak. They could warn her with their eyes and their turned backs, but they could not unknow what she now knew. The hunt was no longer a desperate hope. It was her destiny. She would find the story. She would learn the names and the dates and the reasons, and she would drag the old sins, kicking and screaming, into the light. The market's vibrant chaos faded behind Anya, the cheerful sounds dying in her ears, replaced by the deafening echo of the old woman's silent warning. That look of frantic urgency was a compass needle, pointing unerringly toward a truth so dangerous it could not be spoken aloud. The evasion had not discouraged her. It had lit a path. There was one person in the village, she knew, whose knowledge was as deep as the roots of the oldest oak, whose memory was the living archive of every whispered secret. Marta. She was the oldest of the elders, a woman who lived in a small, isolated cottage on the village's edge, a place people visited for poultices and advice but spoke of in hushed, respectful tones. She was the keeper of stories no one else would tell. Anya waited for 3 days, the resolve hardening within her like winter ice. She chose a time when Boris was occupied with mending a fence far from the house, a task that would consume the afternoon. She did not take the main path, but moved through the woods, her feet silent on the carpet of fallen pine needles, the trees offering a cloak of secrecy. Marta's cottage appeared through the foliage, a small, sturdy structure of stone and timber with a curl of pale smoke rising from its chimney. It looked like something from an old tale, a place where truths and potions were brewed in equal measure. The old woman was in her garden, bent over a patch of herbs, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not look up as Anya approached, but her posture shifted, a subtle tightening that suggested she had known she was coming long before she broke from the tree line. "I wondered when you would find your way here, child," Marta said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. She finally straightened, turning eyes of startling clarity upon Anya. They were eyes that had seen decades come and go, eyes that held no surprise, only a deep, weary sorrow. Inside the cottage, the air was thick with the scent of drying herbs and wood smoke. Marta gestured for Anya to sit on a rough-hewn stool by the fire, while she settled into a worn rocking chair, the wood groaning softly with her weight. For a long time, she said nothing, simply studying Anya's face as if reading the history written upon it. The silence was heavy, expectant. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, she began to speak, her voice low and reluctant, as if each word were a stone she was forced to lift. She spoke of a time decades past, of Anya's mother, Ilara, not as a faded memory, but as a vibrant, hopeful girl with a laugh that could light up a room. She spoke of Gregor Petrov, Boris's father, a man of immense wealth and brutal will, whose influence was a shadow over the entire valley. His wife had been a frail, fading woman, and his eye had fallen upon the young, beautiful Ilara. It was not a courtship. It was an acquisition. Marta's words painted a picture of relentless pressure, of veiled threats to Ilara's family, of the unspoken power a man like Gregor wielded in a closed community. Ilara's family, fearful and indebted, had acquiesced. They had looked away, just as Anya's parents had looked away at her own wedding. The relationship, Marta whispered, was one of coercion and control, a dirty secret the village agreed to ignore. It resulted in a pregnancy, Anya's birth. To avoid a scandal that would tarnish the pristine Petrov name, a hasty, respectable marriage was arranged between Ilara and the kind, but weak-willed Pyotr. The truth of Anya's parentage was buried, a secret to be carried to the grave. Boris, raised in the shadow of his father's cruelty, had known. He had grown into a man who saw the world as his father had, a place to be controlled, its secrets to be weaponized. His marriage to Anya was not a random act of cruelty. It was the final, grotesque knot tied in the family's gnarled history, a way to keep the land, the bloodline, and the shame, all contained within the same four walls. When Marta fell silent, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. The tale hung in the air, complete and devastating. Anya felt the story settle into the empty spaces inside her, the final, missing pieces clicking into a horrifying mosaic. She was not just a product of a hidden affair. She was the living consequence of a patriarch's predation and a family's cowardice. Marta leaned forward then, her gnarled hand gripping Anya's wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes were fierce, her voice dropping to a bare, urgent whisper. She had confirmed the truth, but she offered no comfort, only a grave warning. Boris knew the value of silence. He knew the cost of a loose end. She had uncovered the root of the old sin, and in doing so, she had made herself more dangerous to him than ever before. She must tread as if walking on frozen river ice, for the slightest misstep could plunge her into a darkness from which there would be no return. Marta's warning was a cold stone in Anya's pocket, a constant, chilling reminder that knowledge was not power, but peril. The elder's tale had given shape and name to the monster haunting her life, but it had also stripped away the last vestiges of ignorance that might have offered a fragile protection. She moved through the farmhouse now with the hyper-awareness of prey that knows it is being hunted. Every creak of a floorboard a potential footfall, every shift in Boris's mood a portent of storm. The story of her mother's subjugation was a map of her own captivity, a generational curse playing out in the same grim key. But Marta's words had also planted a new, desperate seed of purpose. The story was not enough. She needed proof, something tangible, something written in her mother's own hand that could not be dismissed as the ramblings of a frightened girl or the gossip of an old woman. Her parents' house, the place of her childhood, stood silent and shuttered on the edge of the village, a monument to the complicity that had delivered her into this nightmare. Getting there was a risk that made her hands tremble. She waited for a day when Boris was called to a neighboring farm to settle a dispute over a stray cow, a matter that would take hours. The walk was a blur of heightened senses, her ears straining for the sound of a familiar cart, her heart leaping at every distant figure on the road. She slipped around to the back of the quiet house, the windows dark, her parents likely at the market. The key was still hidden beneath the loose stone by the back step, a secret from a life that felt a century past. Inside, the air was still and smelled faintly of the lavender her mother used to keep the linens fresh. The familiarity of it was a physical ache. She did not dare linger, her mission a frantic, focused thing. She went straight to her mother's old bedroom, a space she had rarely entered even as a child. It was Spartan, neat, holding no clues in its neatly made bed or its single, plain wardrobe. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for a hiding place, a loose floorboard, a space behind a drawer. Nothing. Despair began to claw at her, the fear of discovery mounting with each passing second. Then, standing in the small, overgrown garden where her mother had once tended her herbs, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Her mother, kneeling in the dirt, her hands buried in the soil, speaking not to Anya, but to herself, her voice a soft, sorrowful murmur. "The earth keeps all secrets," she had said. "It's the only safe place at the time." Anya had thought it was just a whimsy. Now it felt like a signpost. She rushed to the far corner of the garden, to the patch where her mother had grown her rosemary and sage, plants she had said were for protection and clarity. Dropping to her knees, her fingers, still raw from Boris's endless chores, dug frantically into the cool, dark soil. The earth gave way easily, as if it had been disturbed before. Just a few inches down, her nails scraped against something that was not a root or a stone. It was a bundle, wrapped in waxed cloth and tied securely with twine. Her breath hitched. She pulled it from its earthen grave, the cloth stained and damp, but the contents inside protected. Cradling the bundle, she scrambled behind the thick trunk of a gnarled apple tree, hidden from view of the house and the road. With trembling, mud-caked fingers, she untied the twine and peeled back the layers of waxed cloth. Inside was a small, leather-bound book, its cover soft with age, its pages edged with gold leaf that was now tarnished. On the front, in faded ink, were the initials E.P. Ilara Petrov, her mother's maiden name. It was her diary. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, a young woman's script, filled with the hopeful loops and flourishes of a life not yet broken. But the words themselves were a chronicle of a slow suffocation. The early entries spoke of a girl's dreams, of a crush on a boy from a neighboring farm, of plans to see the world beyond the valley. Then, the tone shifted. The name Gregor Petrov began to appear, first as a mention of his power, then as a looming, ominous presence. "He watches me," one entry read, the words stark and simple. "His eyes are like weights." Another spoke of her parents' growing anxiety, their whispered arguments that ceased when she entered the room. "Father says we have no choice. Mother will not look at me." Anya's heart pounded as she flipped through the pages, her eyes devouring the desperate script. The entries became shorter, more frantic. They spoke of forced meetings, of gifts that felt like threats, of a terrible, growing certainty. "I am a bird in a cage, and he holds the key," her mother had written, the ink blotted in one spot as if by a tear. The final entries before a long gap were the most devastating. They spoke of a secret pregnancy, of a family's shame, of a hastily arranged marriage to Pyotr presented not as a salvation, but as another form of imprisonment, a transaction to seal the silence. "They have sold my future to bury his past," the last line on the page read, the words etched with a finality that stole the air from Anya's lungs. She clutched the diary to her chest, the leather cool against her skin. The earth had not kept the secret. It had yielded it up. In her hands, she held not just a book, but her mother's anguish, her voice from beyond the grave, confirming every terrible detail of Marta's story. It was more than a hint. It was a testament. The proof she had so desperately sought was now hers, a fragile, paper-thin weapon against the fortress of lies that had defined her life. But as she carefully rewrapped the diary and hid it beneath her shawl, the weight of it felt immense. She was no longer just carrying a secret. She was carrying her mother's ghost, and its silent scream for justice. The diary felt like a living thing in Anya's hands, a fragile, paper heart still beating with her mother's stolen life. Back in the suffocating silence of her room at the farmhouse, with the door bolted and a chair wedged beneath the handle, she unwrapped the waxed cloth with a reverence bordering on terror. The scent of damp earth and old leather rose from the pages. The smell of a buried soul exhumed. The fading afternoon light slanted through the small, grimy window, falling across the elegant script as she began to read in earnest, diving into the depths of the story she had only glimpsed in the garden. The early pages were a landscape of a life she had never known her mother possessed. They spoke of a girl who loved the feel of sun on her skin, who dreamed of the sea she had only heard of in stories, who pressed wildflowers between the pages of books and imagined a future built on love, not duty. The words were bright, filled with a youthful energy that made the subsequent darkness even more profound. The change began subtly. Gregor Petrov's name started to appear not as a distant patriarch, but as an ever-present shadow. Her mother wrote of his visits, which were not social calls but inspections, his eyes cataloging her as if she were a piece of livestock. He would bring small, expensive gifts, a silk ribbon, a silver hairpin, that felt less like presents and more like brands, marking her as his property. The manipulation was meticulously detailed, a slow, grinding process of psychological erosion. Gregor would speak to her parents of debts, of favors owed, of the precariousness of their position in the village. He never made a direct threat. He didn't need to. The implication was a cage being built around Alara, one invisible bar at a time. Her father became withdrawn, her mother perpetually anxious, their love for her warped by a fear greater than their protectiveness. An entry, dated just a month before her 16th birthday, was a cry of despair. "They say I must be grateful for his attention," Alara had written, the penmanship shaky. Asterisk, "They say it will secure our family's future. They do not see they are selling my soul star." Then came the account of the coercion, written in a stark, unadorned style that was more devastating than any flourish. It was not a seduction. It was an annexation. Gregor, using the leverage he had so carefully cultivated over her family, had cornered her in the hayloft of their own barn. The entry was brief, the words chilling in their simplicity. Asterisk, he said, "It was time I understood my place. I fought. It did not matter. The world is a room with the door locked, and he holds the key." Asterisk, Anya's own breath caught, her vision blurring with hot, furious tears. She was reading the blueprint of her own violation, the same dynamic of power and powerlessness playing out a generation later. The diary then laid bare the cover-up, the cold, calculated machinery that had whirred into motion to protect the Petrov name and its coveted land holdings. When Alara discovered she was with child, the panic in the household was palpable. Gregor's solution was swift and brutal. Pyotr, a gentle, unassuming man deeply in love with Alara, was approached. He was offered a substantial dowry, the forgiveness of his family's debts, and the hand of the woman he adored. The price was his silence, his agreement to raise another man's child as his own. He had agreed, his love and his weakness intertwining to become another link in the chain. The wedding was a quiet, hurried affair, the village accepting the story of a premature baby with the same passive complicity with which they would later accept Anya's marriage to Boris. The final entries were the most heartbreaking. They described a profound, isolating sorrow. Alara wrote of looking at her newborn daughter, at Anya, with a love so fierce it was agony, and a shame so deep it threatened to drown her. She felt like a ghost in her own life, playing a part in a play she had never auditioned for. "My daughter," she wrote in one of the last entries, the ink blotted and smeared. Asterisk, "My beautiful, innocent daughter. What world have I brought you into? What inheritance of silence is yours? Star." Anya closed the diary, the soft click of the cover a sound of absolute finality. The full, horrific truth was now inside her, a searing brand on her soul. It was not just a story of incest and cover-up. It was a detailed map of generational predation, of how love could be weaponized and fear could be institutionalized. The rage that rose in her was a clean, white-hot flame, burning away the last remnants of her fear. It was a fury for her mother, for the girl whose dreams had been trampled into the dirt. It was a fury for herself, for the childhood stolen and the life imposed. And it was a fury for the system, the silent, collusive village that had allowed it all to happen, not once, but twice. Sorrow came too, a vast, oceanic grief for the mother she had never truly known, for the love that had been twisted into an instrument of control. But the sorrow did not weaken her. It fueled the rage, tempering it into something hard, sharp, and unyielding. She carefully rewrapped the diary, this testament of a broken life, and hid it with the family tree from the attic. These were no longer just secrets. They were weapons. The determination that solidified within her was as cold and hard as the iron lock on the chest. She would not endure. She would not hide. She would expose it all. She would tear down the walls of silence, no matter the cost, and force the entire village to look upon the heartbreaking truth they had helped to bury. The Harvest Festival was the village's one true spectacle, a fleeting season of music and laughter where the grim realities of survival were momentarily forgotten beneath a veneer of communal cheer. For Anya, the approaching celebration was no longer a date on the calendar. It was a weapon, a stage, a fixed point in time upon which she would stake her entire future. The decision crystallized in the dead of night, as she lay awake listening to the house settle around her, the silence thick with the ghosts of her mother's words and the weight of her own stolen life. The festival, with its gathered entirety of the village, was her only chance. In the crowded square, surrounded by neighbors and friends, Boris would be at his most vulnerable, his control momentarily diluted by the demands of public performance. It was the one place where he could not easily silence her, the one moment where a single shouted truth could shatter decades of careful lies. With the grim focus of a general preparing for a final, desperate battle, she began her preparations. Her evidence was her arsenal, and she gathered it with a meticulous, trembling care. From its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard, she retrieved the waxed cloth bundle containing her mother's diary, its pages a chronicle of anguish that she would now use as a declaration of war. She retrieved the family tree from the attic, the parchment feeling brittle and malevolent in her hands, its inked lines a diagram of her own damnation. She added the few old photographs she had taken, the one of her young mother standing beside Boris, their shared features now a testament to the secret they shared. These items, once sources of paralyzing horror, were now cold, hard facts. They were the bones of her story, and she would flesh them out with the fire of her own rage. Alone in her room, with the door securely barred, she began to rehearse. She stood before the small, cracked mirror, her reflection a pale, determined ghost. She practiced the words she would say, her voice a low, steady murmur at first, then growing in strength and conviction. She spoke of the family tree, of the line connecting brother and sister. She spoke of the diary, of Gregor Petrov's predation and the community's complicit silence. She detailed the calculated cover-up, the forced marriage to Pyotr, and the final, grotesque act of her own union with Boris, a move designed to keep the shame and the property locked within the same gnarled bloodline. She crafted her speech not as a plea, but as an accusation, a stark, unadorned recitation of facts that would leave no room for denial or dismissal. Fear was a constant companion, a cold serpent coiled around her spine. With every practiced word, she imagined Boris's reaction. The fury in his eyes, the violence that simmered just beneath his controlled exterior. She envisioned the stunned faces of the villagers, the shock giving way to anger, to denial, to a collective rage turned against her, the messenger who dared to poison their festival. Her family, her own parents, would be there, their shame and terror a public spectacle. The potential for retaliation was not a vague threat. It was a certainty. She could be cast out, beaten, or worse, disappeared into the isolation of the farmhouse forever, her truth dismissed as the hysterical ravings of a troubled girl. But the fear no longer had the power to paralyze her. It had become a fuel. Each tremor of her hands, each cold knot of dread in her stomach, only solidified her resolve. She was no longer fighting just for herself, but for the ghost of her mother, for the girl in the diary whose voice had been systematically silenced. To stay silent now would be to become another link in the chain, another generation complicit in the family's rot. The plan was a terrifying gamble, a leap into an abyss with no guarantee of a safe landing. But the alternative, a life of continued silence, of living as a secret in her own skin, was a fate far worse than any retaliation he could devise. She folded the evidence back into its hiding place, her movements calm and deliberate. The plan was set. The stage was chosen. All that remained was to wait for the music to start, and for the moment to step into the light and speak the words that would either set her free or destroy her completely. The Harvest Festival was a lie woven in bright colors and raucous sound, a tapestry of forced merriment that mocked the darkness festering in Anya's heart. The village square, usually a place of quiet toil, was now a sea of bodies, the air thick with the sense of spiced ale, roasting meat, and the cloying sweetness of candied apples. Laughter rang out, sharp and brittle, and a frenetic fiddle tune sawed at the edges of the gathering, a soundtrack to the charade. Anya stood at the periphery, a statue of stillness in the swirling chaos. The small, cloth-wrapped bundle hidden beneath her shawl felt like a lodestone, its weight pulling her toward a precipice. She could see Boris across the square, a tankard in his hand, holding court with a group of other farmers, his laughter a deep, performative boom that did not reach his eyes. He was playing his part, the respected landowner, the pillar of the community. Soon, she would tear the mask away. Her moment came when the fiddler paused for a breath and the village elder stepped onto the small wooden dais to offer the traditional blessing for the season's bounty. As the old man began to speak, his voice a familiar, droning comfort, Anya started to move. She did not walk. She glided, a specter cutting through the crowd, her gaze fixed on the platform. A path seemed to open before her, villagers instinctively shifting aside, their chatter dying as they registered the grim intensity on her face. She reached the dais just as the elder finished his prayer, and before he could step down, before anyone could react, she was upon it. A sudden, bewildered silence fell over the square. Hundreds of eyes turned to her, curious, confused. Anya's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trying to escape its cage. She could see her parents in the crowd, their faces frozen in identical masks of dawning horror. She saw Marta, standing apart near the edge of the woods, her expression unreadable. And she saw Boris, his tankard lowered, his affable mask slipping to reveal a core of cold, sharp fury. The air crackled with anticipation. Then she began to speak. Her voice, which she had feared would be a reedy whisper, emerged clear and steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. She did not shout. She declared. She held up the family tree, the parchment trembling in her grip, and named the names, tracing the line from Boris to her mother, Elara, with a finger that did not shake. She spoke the word that had haunted her, the word that defined her prison. Brother. A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd, a wave of shock. Before the murmurs could rise, she held up her mother's diary, its leather cover a dark accusation in the afternoon sun. She recounted the story it held, not as a tale but as a crime. She spoke of Gregor Petrov's predation, of the coercion, of the cover-up woven from fear and greed, of her own birth as a secret to be buried, and of her marriage as the final, grotesque knot in the family's rotten history. For a moment, there was only a stunned, profound silence. Then, the square erupted. Boris's roar of denial was a physical force. He surged forward, his face a thundercloud of purpled rage, his fists clenched. He called her a liar, a mad girl, a viper he had sheltered in his home. He spat venom, his words lashing out, trying to shred her credibility, to paint her as hysterical, ungrateful, possessed by fanciful stories. But the evidence was in her hands, and his fury was too raw, too violent, too much the reaction of a man whose foundation was crumbling. The crowd did not know which way to turn. The festival's fragile unity shattered into 1,000 shards of chaos. Some villagers, their faces etched with long-held suspicion, nodded grimly, their whispered confirmations weaving through the tumult. Others, their lives and livelihoods tied to the Petrov name, shouted their support for Boris, their voices rising in an angry chorus of denial, calling for Anya to be taken away, silenced. Families turned on one another, arguments flaring like sudden fires. A woman shrieked, a man shoved another, and the cheerful square became a maelstrom of accusation, defense, and raw, bewildered fear. The truth, once spoken, was a wildfire, and Anya stood at its center, watching the world she had known burn to the ground around her. The festival square, once a stage for communal joy, had become a fractured landscape of shock and division. The air, which moments before had been sweet with celebration, was now thick with the acrid smoke of shattered illusions and rising tempers. Anya stood on the dais, the family tree and diary still clutched in her white-knuckled hands, watching the chaos her words had unleashed. The unified body of the village had ruptured along hidden fault lines, splitting into warring factions right before her eyes. Boris, his face a mask of thunderous fury, was surrounded by a knot of staunch defenders. Men whose loyalties were bought with debt or fear, women who clung to the old hierarchies for their own precarious safety. Their voices rose in a protective clamor, shouting down the truth, branding Anya a troublemaker, a story weaver intent on destroying their way of life. But across the square, another group was forming. They were the quiet ones, the ones with long memories and weary eyes. They did not shout, but their silence was a potent force. They were the families who had also suffered under the Petrov's shadow, who had lost land in disputed deals, or who simply remembered the fate of Alara with a pity they had never dared voice. They looked at Anya not with anger, but with a dawning, grim respect. A few of the younger women, their own futures looking suddenly less certain, met her gaze and gave almost imperceptible nods, a silent transfer of solidarity. This schism was not clean. It cut through families, turning brother against brother, friend against friend. The festival was over. In its place was a cold, simmering civil war. Anya's family found her in the tumult. Their approach was not one of comfort, but of frantic damage control. Her father's face was ashen, his hands trembling as he gripped her arm, his voice a desperate, hissed whisper. He begged her to recant, to say it was a story, a misunderstanding born of stress and loneliness. He spoke of family honor, of the shame she was bringing upon them all, his eyes pleading with her to return to the safety of silence. Her mother stood slightly behind him, weeping silent, helpless tears, her face a mirror of the anguish in her diary. Their attempts to pull her back from the ledge felt like a final, profound betrayal. They were not trying to save her. They were trying to rebury the truth, to shovel the dirt back over a grave that had taken all her courage to open. As her parents tried to physically steer her away from the dais, a hand fell on her other shoulder. It was Marta. The old woman's grip was firm, her eyes blazing with a fierce light. She did not speak, but her presence was a shield. With her were a few others, the baker whose father had lost a field to Gregor, the weaver whose sister had once caught Boris's unwanted eye. They formed a small, protective phalanx around Anya, their silent defiance a counterweight to her family's pleas and the rising threats from Boris's faction. A man from across the square shouted a vile insult, his face contorted with rage. Another threw a rotten apple that splattered near her feet. In that moment, cornered by her family's fear and surrounded by the venom of her enemies, Anya found a strange, cold clarity. The support of Marta and her handful of allies was not just personal. It was historical. They were not just defending her. They were acknowledging a generational deception that had poisoned the village for decades. She saw the full, horrifying depth of it now. This was not one family's secret. It was a systemic rot, a culture of silence enforced by economic leverage and social pressure, where the powerful could pray and the community would look away. Her marriage was not an anomaly. It was the logical, monstrous conclusion of a system built on lies. The strength she drew from her small band of allies was not the warmth of friendship, but the cold, hard steel of shared truth. They were the first cracks in the dam, and she had been the force that broke it. The confrontation was over, but the real battle for the soul of the village, and for her own survival, had just begun. The protective circle Marta and her allies had formed around Anya was a fragile fortress in a village now openly at war with itself. The walk back from the fractured festival was a gauntlet of hissed threats and averted gazes, the once familiar path feeling alien and hostile. Boris's rage was a living thing, a storm cloud that had trailed them back to the farmhouse's edge, his promise of a reckoning hanging in the air, unspoken but deafening. Inside the cold, silent house, the walls felt thinner than ever, the locks flimsy. Anya knew, with a certainty that was as calm as it was terrifying, that she would not survive another night under this roof. The confrontation had not brought justice. It had unleashed a predator cornered. Her truth was a spark, but it needed kindling from the outside world to become a fire that could not be extinguished. She had to flee. Her planning began the moment the door closed behind her, a frantic, silent inventory of necessity and risk. The evidence was her lifeline, her only currency in a world that had already proven it would rather bury its sins than acknowledge them. She retrieved the diary and the family tree from their hiding place, her hands moving with a swift, sure efficiency born of desperation. She wrapped them again in the waxed cloth, creating a flat, secure packet that she could conceal against her body. A single change of clothes, a heel of hard bread, a small wedge of cheese, these were the meager provisions of her escape. There were no sentimental tokens, no reminders of a childhood that had been a lie. Her entire life was now condensed into a small bundle of truth and the clothes on her back. As dusk bled into a moonless, star-cloaked night, a soft, rhythmic tapping came at the kitchen window, Marta's signal. The old woman moved with a stealth that belied her years, her form a deeper shadow in the darkness. She pressed a rough-sketched map into Anya's hand, the lines indicating game trails and forgotten paths through the woods that would bypass the main road and the watchful eyes of Boris's loyalists. Marta's own nephew, a carter who made early morning deliveries to the nearest town, would be waiting at a designated crossroads at dawn. A whispered word, a payment of a few coins Marta had provided, and he would take her. No questions would be asked. It was a chain of trust, a secret network operating in the cracks of the village's division. Marta's final embrace was brief but fierce, a transfer of strength, her eyes saying everything her lips could not. Go. Live star. Alone again, with only the sound of her own heartbeat for company, Anya waited for the deep of the night, the hour when even watchdogs and guilty men slept. She stood at the small window of her room, looking out at the oppressive darkness of the land that had claimed her mother and had tried to claim her. This was not just an escape from a man or a house. It was a severing from the very soil of her ancestry, a rejection of a legacy built on oppression and silence. The courage it took to turn her back on everything she had ever known was not a roaring, heroic thing. It was a quiet, desperate strength, forged in the cold fire of betrayal and honed by the absolute certainty that staying meant a slow, silent death of the spirit, or a swift, violent one of the body. It was the courage to choose the unknown perils of the dark forest over the certain tyranny of the familiar. When the house was at its most silent, a tomb holding its breath, she moved. She slipped the latch on the back door, the click unnaturally loud in the stillness. A final glance over her shoulder showed the dark, hulking shape of the farmhouse, a place that had held so many secrets and so much sorrow. Then, she turned and stepped into the cool, free air of the night. She did not run, but moved with a swift, ground-eating pace, her feet finding the narrow path Marta had described, her body a shadow among shadows. Each step away from the house was a step toward a precipice, but it was also a step into a vast, terrifying, and beautiful possibility. She was breaking free, not just from a man, but from generations of expectation, her escape a silent scream of defiance against the oppressive weight of the past, her small, determined figure swallowed by the liberating darkness. The first light of dawn was a pale, hesitant smear on the horizon when the cart crested the final hill, revealing the town sprawled in the valley below. To Anya, it was a vision from another world. The buildings were not of rough-hewn timber but of pale, painted stone, their roofs a patchwork of slate and tile. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys, not just a few, and the distant sounds were not of roosters and livestock but of rumbling wheels and a low, constant hum of human industry. After a night spent fleeing through the silent, watchful woods, every muscle aching and her nerves stretched taut, the sight was both overwhelming and profoundly liberating. The carter, a man of few words who had accepted Marta's coins with a grim nod, pointed a thick finger toward a larger, official-looking building near the center. The constabulary. Her destination. The town streets were just beginning to stir as she walked, her bundle clutched tight beneath her shawl. The stares of early risers felt like physical touches, but they were the stares of strangers, devoid of the knowing contempt or fearful pity of the village. Here, she was not Anya Petrov, the girl from the cursed family. She was simply a girl in a worn dress, her story yet untold. The constabulary door was heavy, its dark wood intimidating. Taking a breath that felt like her first true one in years, she pushed it open. The inside was a place of quiet authority, smelling of ink, wood polish, and stale coffee. A man in a crisp uniform looked up from behind a high desk, his expression shifting from boredom to professional curiosity as he took in her disheveled state, the mud on her shoes, the fierce, determined light in her eyes that belied her exhaustion. She did not weep or plead. She simply laid her waxed cloth bundle on the counter and, in the same clear, steady voice she had used at the festival, began to speak. She spoke of the family tree, of the diary, of the generations of secrets and the marriage that was a prison. She presented the evidence not as a victim, but as a witness, her words a stark, factual report of crimes long buried. The constable's face grew increasingly grave, his initial skepticism replaced by a focused intensity as he carefully examined the brittle parchment and the faded script of the diary. He asked quiet, precise questions, and she answered them all, her story unfolding like a dark, intricate tapestry. Leaving the constabulary felt like shedding a skin. The official world was now in motion, its gears slowly turning to investigate the truth she had delivered. The immediate, suffocating threat of Boris was replaced by the procedural pace of the law, a strange and unfamiliar safety. A kind-faced woman from a charitable society, alerted by the constable, found her waiting on the steps. She spoke softly of a place Anya could go, a sanctuary for women with nowhere else to turn. She led her through the waking streets to a plain, sturdy building with a freshly painted blue door, a women's shelter. Inside, the air was clean and smelled of soap and baking bread. It was not luxurious, but it was safe. The walls were not lined with grim portraits, but with simple drawings and notices of community meetings. The other women there moved with a quiet dignity, their eyes holding stories of their own struggles, but also a shared resilience. They offered her a hot meal, a bath, and a narrow cot in a room she would not have to share with a ghost or a jailer. As she sat on the edge of the clean bed, the simple cotton of a donated nightdress soft against her skin, a feeling washed over her so foreign it took a moment to recognize it. It was a glimmer, small and fragile, like the first star appearing in a twilight sky. It was hope, lying in the dark later, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the town. A distant clock chiming, the murmur of voices from another room, the enormity of her journey settled upon her. She had escaped the physical prison, but the deeper chains of shame and silence were also beginning to loosen. The confrontation, the escape, the act of speaking her truth to a dispassionate authority. It had all been a reclamation. She was no longer just a survivor of a family's darkness. She was a chronicler of it. The hope she felt was not for a life of ease, but for a life of purpose. Closing her eyes, she made a new vow, one born not of fear, but of fierce, hard-won conviction. She would not let her story end with her own rescue. She would find a way to use her voice, to become an advocate for the others, the the girls and women still trapped in the silent prisons of their own families and communities. Her new beginning was not an end to the fight. It was the moment she picked up a new, more powerful weapon, vowing to turn her personal tragedy into a beacon for others lost in the same oppressive dark.